Well done, Kurt. I have a hunch when you come up to share the evening's announcements and dismiss us that you'll not acknowledge the excellent job our speaker did, so I will save you the trouble. Well done. Well said. Thank you, Michael, for leading our singing. And Gregory, all the way back there in the rear of the building, for directing our minds in prayer. We are going to begin tonight our study of Daniel, and I have been looking forward to this study since it was announced a month or so ago, and I hope that when we've finished that you can honestly say that it has been well worth our time and effort. If you are going to break Daniel down into sections, it's a fairly easily done task. The first 6 chapters deal with stories designed to build our faith. And the last 6 deal with apocalyptic and prophetic matters that are so unique and precise that my conviction is that an honest person who goes to Daniel, reads and understands its message, will walk away convinced that there is a God who does rule in the affairs of men, because that's at the heart of this book. That the God of heaven, our Creator and our Father, knows the end from the beginning, and Daniel, the man of God, the prophet of God, was able to look into the future with an uncanny degree of accuracy and predict events, sometimes with minute detail, that ultimately were fulfilled, and we can point to the historical fulfillment of those events. And the book is so accurate that critics deny that it was even written by Daniel, and that it was written in the days in which Daniel lived and served God, because they do not believe that it is possible to know the future, unless, of course, you're talking about climate change. But Daniel was a prophet of God, and he looked centuries down the road and wrote what God revealed to him. And from our perspective today, we can look at that record and history and see just how accurate it was. One of the interesting features of Daniel, and this is not apparent to readers of the English translation, is that Daniel is written in 2 languages. It is written in Hebrew, the language of the Jews, and sections of it are written in Aramaic, which was the language that was typically spoken in Babylon during Daniel's day. There is a 3rd language that Daniel does not utilize, called Akkadian. That's the language of Babylonian history, and actually you may be surprised to know that there are several examples of Babylonian history, including the Babylonian Chronicles, written in cuneiform. That's a language that is written on clay with a stylus by making impressions in the clay. Generally, it's a difficult language to learn and even more difficult to write. But Daniel does not use Akkadian. He uses Hebrew and Aramaic, which is an alphabetic language very similar to Hebrew. And as we will learn in chapter 1, Daniel will be educated by the Babylonians for approximately 3 years, and does quite well with his education, and it would have been a fairly easy transition from Hebrew, his native language, to the language that was what we would style today the lingua franca of that world. Today, English basically serves that function, though I'm not sure how much longer that will be the case, but at least at this time that's the case, and in Daniel's day it was Aramaic. So chapter 1, verse 1 through chapter 4, chapter 2, verse 4a, there's a section in the middle of the fourth verse of chapter 2 where he switches from Hebrew to Aramaic, and he continues in Aramaic through the close of chapter 7, and then he returns in chapter 8 and writes from 8:1 through the close of chapter 12 in Hebrew again. And you may raise the question at the outset, why would he do such a thing? And the answer is not in the text, but as you do read the account, the sections that are written in Aramaic generally relay matters that relate specifically to Babylon, and those written in Hebrew seem to address primarily readers who have a Jewish background. So that seems to be a good reason why he would utilize that particular methodology. If you ask who wrote Daniel, the obvious answer is that Daniel wrote it. It is a book that, to a great extent, is all about Daniel, but he is generally, but not universally, but generally acknowledged to be the writer. That's because, and I think this, from my perspective at least, gives me an unequivocal answer to the question of authorship. Jesus, in Matthew's Gospel and the parallel in Mark, made reference to a specific statement attributing it to Daniel the prophet, and it comes obviously from the book in the Old Testament that bears Daniel's name. So Jesus acknowledged Daniel as the author, and if Jesus accepted the authorship of Daniel, that is good enough for me. When I read Old Testament books, I want to know the specific time frame, if possible, in which the author writes, because it helps me understand what is being written and make the proper application. If you read Daniel, it becomes apparent that he wrote his book sometime probably between 538 and 528 BC, after the events of chapters 5 and 6. And chapter 5 is the record of the fall of Babylon and the rise of the Medo-Persian Empire. And chapter 6 is the record of Daniel in the lion's den. The apocalyptic material that begins in chapter 7 and goes through 12 is written during that period of events that are chronicled in the first 6 chapters, and in many cases in the last 6 chapters, Daniel tells us the time frame in which the visions he saw and the messages he records are given. One of the things that liberals argue is that Daniel was written probably around 168 BC to perhaps 158 BC, because Daniel describes an event during the Maccabean period of history. That's the intertestamental period between the close of the Old Testament in Malachi and the beginning of the New in Matthew. There was a man by the name of Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who actually desecrated the temple and the altar and sacrificed a hog upon the altar. It was the abomination of desolation that Jesus addressed in his statements in Matthew and in Mark. And scholars are so certain that Daniel described that coming event that they just can't wrap their heads around the fact that God would have revealed this to Daniel centuries before the fulfillment would occur. And thus they claim that the book had to be written, at least that section, after the events occurred. There's a real problem with that, by the way. The Old Testament translation into Greek, called the Septuagint, was completed by 250 BC, and that was done in Alexandria. And it contained the entire book of Daniel. So all of Daniel was known before the events that the critics claim had to occur before it could have been written. So when I look at Daniel and I have any question at all about whether or not the Bible is inspired, those doubts are removed immediately when I come to terms with what God revealed to Daniel, which can only be accomplished with divine help. Let me clue you in. Nobody knows the future. There are people who claim to know the future, but they don't. God does. And I have reminded you repeatedly of a statement that is found in Isaiah. When Isaiah contrasts the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob with all the pagan gods of the world, he says, among other things, that the God of Israel knows the end from the beginning. No one, no human being has that ability. And so Daniel's ability to forecast the future can only be explained by acknowledging divine assistance. Daniel, interestingly, is found outside of the book that bears his name in Ezekiel. Ezekiel was actually, with Jeremiah, contemporaries of Daniel. But in Ezekiel's book, in chapter 14, verse 14, and again in verse 20, Ezekiel mentions Noah, Daniel, and Job as representatives of righteous men who served God faithfully. There are some who are critical of that, saying that Ezekiel could not have known of this Daniel at that time. But when you understand the events that are chronicled in Daniel and realize that Ezekiel lived and actually wrote during this same time period, it would be pretty hard not to hear about the things that Daniel and his friends accomplished by the power of God. So that's a silly idea to say that Ezekiel couldn't have known about Daniel and classified him with both Job and Noah. But clearly, Daniel is acknowledged by Ezekiel as being one of the truly great men of God in the Old Testament, and I think another indication why we need to give the book serious consideration. As we begin to look at the text, I will tell you that the very first verse presents a problem to the critics. And we're going to look at Daniel as a textual study. I just wanted to share a few things with you before we begin that textual study so you get the background. We're approximately 538 BC. The Babylonians have defeated the Assyrians and then defeated Judah. They entered Jerusalem in about 605 BC, a second time in 597 BC, and a third time in 586 BC. And in that third incursion, the city was leveled, the walls destroyed, the temple reduced to rubble. That led to the captivity of Judah, which began in 605, Daniel and his friends among those who are taken from Jerusalem and resettled in Babylon, where they will be re-educated, or some might say indoctrinated, so that they can serve the Babylonian Empire. The Babylonian Empire, for those of you who may not know, will fall to the Medes and Persians under the leadership of Cyrus the Great, and that actually occurs about 539 BC. And the record of the fall of Babylon is recorded in Daniel 5. Jeremiah had predicted that there would be a 70-year period of captivity. That captivity began with Daniel and his friends 606, 605 BC, ended 536, 535 BC, when Cyrus the Great decreed that those who had been uprooted from Judah and settled in Babylon were free to go back home if they so chose. That's where the books of Ezra and Nehemiah come into play as the record is given historically of the return from Babylonian exile. Jeremiah had predicted that this exile would last 70 years, and Isaiah had even predicted that Cyrus would be the one who would give those Jews who had been deported to Babylon the privilege of returning. Interestingly, if you like to look at history, the Medo-Persian Empire was ultimately conquered by the Greeks under the leadership of Alexander the Great, the son of Philip of Macedon. You're not very familiar, I suspect, with Philip, but you may be familiar with his daughter's name, Alexander's sister, because Thessalonica was named after Philip's daughter and Alexander's sister. Alexander conquered the world by the age of 32 and then died suddenly. And Daniel actually predicted not only the events that I've just mentioned, but the death of Alexander and how his kingdom would be then divided into 4 parts, and ultimately concludes with the destruction of that specific period under the leadership of what ultimately came to be the Ptolemies and the Seleucids at the hands of the Romans. And he says, in the days of these kings, meaning the Romans, God's going to do something really wonderful. He's going to set up his own kingdom. And we are living proof of the accuracy of that prophecy, because if you are a Christian, you are a part of God's kingdom, a kingdom that is universal in its scope and eternal in terms of its duration. And Daniel predicts all of that in the course of his book. So let's open our Bibles to Daniel chapter 1, or look at the screen, and we will start through the text at this time. Let's see what's going on here. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. This would be 605 BC. Jehoiakim is the ruler of Judah at this time, the capital being Jerusalem. In earlier years, his grandfather, Josiah, the last good king of Judah, had mounted an army and met Pharaoh Necho and the Egyptians on the plains of Megiddo. Josiah was defeated, and a new king, Jehoahaz, came to the throne. This began the real decline of Judah after the renovations to the temple and the restoration of worship and the things that Josiah had initiated. Jehoahaz was removed, and Jehoiakim came to the throne. He is ruling Judah at the time of this Babylonian invasion. Nebuchadnezzar is not king at this very moment. He will become king when his daddy dies in 605 BC. But he's been leading the army earlier, about 606 to 611 to 606. The Assyrians have been destroyed by the Babylonian army under the leadership of Nebuchadnezzar. And having defeated the Assyrians, he turned his attention to the Jews and Jerusalem. One of the things that the critics point to about this text is that there is a supposed contradiction already in Daniel 1:1 with something that is stated in Jeremiah 25:1. So I want to tell you what Jeremiah 25:1 says. And you look at Daniel 1:1 as I read this. The word that came to Jeremiah concerning all the people of Judah in the 4th year of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, that was the 1st year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon. And yet, as we begin our study today, this is the 3rd year in the reign of Jehoiakim, not the 4th. And so the question is, did Jeremiah or Daniel get it wrong? And these are the kinds of things that people who want to pick at the Bible are always pointing to. But the answer is pretty simple and easily obtained if you do a little research. Jeremiah writes using the typical dating style of the Jews. Daniel writes using the typical dating style of the Babylonians. The Babylonians did not count the first year of a king's reign. That was year 0. The Israelites, on the other hand, counted the first year of a king's reign to be any year within the year when the king comes to the throne. If he comes to the throne in December, that's still his first year. When you look at the record of Jeremiah, the date that Jeremiah gives is 605 BC. And when you look at Daniel, who's writing from Babylon, and he is a representative of the Babylonian government, and in fact, a major portion of his book is written in the Babylonian language of the day, he uses their dating method, which gives the same date, 605. So the critics, by being critical, do one thing and only one thing: expose their own ignorance. And I cite this, and I know you're thinking, this doesn't seem to be a big deal, but it is just illustrative of the kinds of things that happen all the time with the Bible. And when the critics are answered time after time after time, their folly is exposed, and the Bible is demonstrated to be accurate in what it reveals. Never forget that the Bible, and I've said this numerous times as well, is true in what it touches, true in what it tells, and true in what it teaches. And in this case, Jeremiah and Daniel are both accurate and ultimately give the same date of 605 BC. Now, we know who Jehoiakim is. He's the king of Judah. He will ultimately be removed by Nebuchadnezzar. There is no account of his death in Scripture. The last time we meet him in Scripture, he's bound in chains. But Josephus reports, and Jeremiah had predicted that Jehoiakim would be buried like a donkey, just thrown out and left to rot. And there's no indication that that prophecy wasn't fulfilled, because though the text tells us that Nebuchadnezzar chained Jehoiakim, it does not say that he returned him or took him to Babylon and incarcerated him or killed him. And so again, there's no contradiction. We just don't have a record of Jehoiakim's fate. Nebuchadnezzar is probably the best known of all the Babylonian kings. And it's because of his interaction with Daniel and what Daniel reveals about him. I don't think there's anyone who has any degree of education at all that hasn't heard of Nebuchadnezzar. If you were asked to name a Babylonian king, I'm sure that's the name that would pop into your mind. I doubt that you would say Evil Merodach, though he was a Babylonian king. Or Nabonidus, another Babylonian king. Or Belshazzar. We don't know those names, at least most people don't, but generally everybody knows Nebuchadnezzar because of his success primarily in relationship to the people of God. In verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand meaning Nebuchadnezzar's hand. And Daniel is wanting his readers to know at the outset that Judah was defeated and Jerusalem destroyed, not because Nebuchadnezzar's army was better or that the army of Judah was helpless. It happened because God gave Judah and Jehoiakim to Babylon. They had time after time turned their backs on God. They worshiped the gods of the people around them, contrary to their law, which expressly forbid worshiping any other gods. They just over and over again fell into idolatry. So Jeremiah, who writes prior to the events in Daniel, warned his people over and over again of the Babylonian invasion and said, accept it. It is God's will. The book of Habakkuk raises the question with God, how can you allow this to happen? And the response to his question is, because Judah is so evil and wicked. But don't fret, Babylon will face a similar fate for her wickedness and sinfulness. And history bears that out. But Daniel wants his readers to know at the outset that what unfolds because God is in control. There's one theme that really pervades the whole book, and that is that God rules in the affairs of men. And I think that is so relevant today as we look about our own nation and the kinds of things that are occurring and what seems to be on the horizon. Never forget, God is still in control. And for those of us who are Christians, our goal is, whatever the conditions are, that we will live for Christ to the extent possible, quiet and peaceful lives in godliness and holiness. That's God's plan. We must never forget who really is in charge. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand with some of the vessels of the house of God. Let me take you quickly to Isaiah 39. Isaiah 39 tells us of King Hezekiah. You remember Hezekiah because he's told by Isaiah the prophet, set your house in order, you're going to die. And the king's response was to go to God and essentially say, Lord, I don't want to die, I want to live. And so God, in response to his prayer, extended his life by 15 years. Now, what is interesting, if you know the story well, is that at the time Hezekiah is told to set his house in order, he is childless. There is no heir to the throne. But during this 15-year extension, Manasseh was conceived, Hezekiah's son, and he succeeded his father to the throne and actually was the longest reigning king of Judah, 55 years. And he was, without a doubt, the very worst king Judah had. I've often wondered, just myself, if it had not been better had Hezekiah died childless. Manasseh was just that evil and wicked. But when he recovered, the Babylonians sent representatives to Hezekiah, kind of well-wishers, supposedly, wanting the king to know that the Babylonians were aware of his recovery and were pleased that he was well again. What did Hezekiah do? He invited them in and showed him not only his personal wealth, but all the treasures of the temple. Now, when we think of the temple, we think primarily of a place of worship, but in some ways, the temple was a lot like a bank today with safety deposit box. It's where the wealth was also stored. When the kings of Israel and Judah, and in particular now we're dealing with Judah, went to battle and were victorious and brought the spoils of war back home, always a portion, in some cases, all of the spoil was dedicated to God, as it was with the city of Jericho. Where do you think that went? The temple was the repository for that treasure. In addition, the instruments of worship in the temple were made of precious metals. And there were many. And Hezekiah showed all of this treasure to the Babylonians. Now, what do you think happens when King Hezekiah opens the doors? It's an invitation to a more powerful nation to come and take what they want. And that's ultimately what will happen. And Isaiah stated it emphatically in Isaiah 39. And you might want to read that sometime at your leisure, with special emphasis on verse 7. So all of these vessels from the house of God were taken. Originally in 605, they took some. They left some so the Jews could continue their worship. In 586, anything that had remained of any value was removed to Babylon. These vessels, by the way, are going to come into play again in chapter 5. And once more, chapter 5 is the story of the fall of Babylon. The king has a party. He brings out these vessels for all of his guests to drink from, desecrating what had been dedicated to the service of God. That's when he saw the handwriting on the wall, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin, and became exceedingly troubled, and Daniel ultimately is summoned to interpret the handwriting and tells the king, in essence, tonight, you'll lose your throne. So those vessels have a rather storied history, if you know it. So they brought them back to the land of Shinar. Now, what is Shinar? Another name for Babylon. In Genesis chapter 11, Moses tells us of an event early in the history of humanity when the people determined that they would build a tower all the way to heaven. The Tower of Babel, built in Babylon, which is also Shinar. So the expression Shinar is just another term for Babylon, one that actually goes all the way back to Genesis 11. He brought them to Babylon, to the house of his God. The god of Nebuchadnezzar, we know historically, was Marduk. Marduk is also called Bel. And interestingly, Nebuchadnezzar's son, who is identified in the Old Testament as evil Merodach, was also called Marduk, or essentially Amel Marduk. The name simply means man of Marduk, man of King Nebuchadnezzar's God. So we know pretty well the temple in Babylon where these treasures were placed. It is common practice. Wars are fought to kill people, to take things. And this is exactly what we see happening when Nebuchadnezzar's army is victorious. Verse 3, then the king commanded Ashpenaz. There are not a lot of characters in Daniel, but this is one of the names you need to recognize. He is the chief eunuch, or some translations say the chief advisor, because the term is not always used in the sense in which we typically associate the word eunuch. It's sometimes a technical term for a high official in government. But the king commanded Ashpenaz to bring some of the people of the land of Israel. It is typical for the Babylonians to not only take the best treasures, but to take the best people. They have special skills. They take them back home to Babylon. They put them to work serving the Babylonians. And so the command was to select of the royal family and the nobility youth without blemish, of good appearance, and skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace, and they're to be taught the literature and language of the Chaldeans. The word Chaldean has two different meanings. One is a simple designation for Babylonians. They're also called Chaldeans, and there is a group of advisors that include astrologers and magicians and soothsayers and Chaldeans that seem to have had at least in the minds of the Babylonians, special abilities to see the future and interpret dreams and things of that nature. And the very best and brightest of Judah are going to be trained to serve in Babylon in this fashion. And notice that there are requirements as to who will be brought back. And I can tell you from what we know of Persian history that in Persia, the typical time for educating young men was from 14 to 17. And so most biblical scholars think that the young men that are brought from Judah, because they believe that the Persians actually may have acquired the practice from the Babylonians of educating young men for 3 years. These young men are going to be educated for a 3-year period. So they're probably around 14 when they are uprooted from Judah and brought to Babylon and begin their schooling. Notice the qualifications. They have to be without blemish. Ancient societies believed that God blessed the best with good looks as well as good brains. And so the young men that are going to be tasked with learning the language and the history of the Chaldeans and many of their practices are to be the best and brightest physically and mentally. So they're going to be without blemish, of good appearance, handsome, skillful in all wisdom. You know, there are people that at a very early age just seem to have a good head on their shoulders. They grow up quickly, and then there are some that just seem never to grow up. These are young men of maturity, that is, men of wisdom, endowed with knowledge. They're young men who are capable of being educated, probably, given the source of these young men among the king's family and the nobility. They've already had a good education in Judah, because education was important, especially for those in leadership positions, and they're going to be, therefore, capable of learning quickly under the tutelage of the Babylonians. So they can understand learning, be confident to stand in the king's palace, because the king needs advisors. He needs advisors who are gifted. You just don't pick anyone off the street, bring them in, and give them the opportunity to offer the king advice. They have to be prepared. And these men, young men, are going to be prepared for that office, and they come from a specific background. And they will learn the language and the history, the customs and practices, and then they'll be put to work. And you can see, I think, wisdom in this. If you're going to rule a nation, you need people who understand that nation and who speak the language and can carry out the orders of the conqueror over the conquered. And this is the way they were able to accomplish that. Next week, we will continue to look at the text. We'll go through it, obviously, a little more quickly than we did tonight, because I wanted to get that introductory stuff out of the way. And we'll highlight the things that really stand out in the passages that we're considering and get to the stories, because the real exciting aspects of Daniel, especially early on, are chapters 2 through 6. And chapter 1 is necessary to understand the role of Daniel in chapters 2 through 6. So you keep reading and be prepared next week to resume with verse 5 and the first problem that Daniel and his friends face.